I'm Elizabeth Sinn, and I'm moderating this session. And I am so delighted that we have real people here, and that we're not looking into a laptop screen and seeing everybody through a Zoom. And I'm really delighted too, because today we have 3 colleagues from Hong Kong University, and they're among my favorite people at this university, so that's really nice. The first to come up to bat is Ghassan Moazzin. He's an assistant professor at this institute and received his BA and PhD from Cambridge University. He will talk about his book and share with us new perspectives on the fascinating subject of foreign banking and global finance in modern China. These perspectives emerge from his thorough plowing through of many archives around the world. And he's been dealing with massive amount of primary sources in several languages, in Chinese, English, German, French, and Japanese. So maybe we have Ghassan to start?
Oh, so I can take this off, right? That was the deal.
You have to be 2 meters away.
Yeah. I'll try. Keep that in mind. Is it working on? Yes, wonderful. Okay, I'll get started then. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming, of course, and thank you in particular to everyone that helped organize our book talk today. So, of course, Izumi, Elizabeth, John Carroll, and John Wong, and Hilson as well, and all our other colleagues at the Institute. And, of course, I'm also very happy to be able to talk to you about my new book, Foreign Banks and Global Finance in Modern China. So in the book, as Elizabeth already kind of pointed to, I trace the history of foreign banks in modern China, and I do that roughly between the 1870s and the end of World War I. This basically involves looking at the activities of these foreign banks in the Chinese banking sector, and also at their role in providing capital for the Chinese government. And in all of that, I sort of wanted to particularly understand what the interaction with Chinese actors was like. And sort of, this is sort of the specific topic that I look at, but the larger question that I wanted to sort of understand when writing this book was that I wanted to know, okay, we know modern China was connected to the global economy in manifold ways in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but how does this actually work out financially? So how was China financially connected to the global economy during this period, which we also normally understand as this like big first wave of modern globalization? And the answer I give in the book is basically that I argue that it were foreign banks that were the key intermediary institution that financially connected the Chinese economy to Western economies and facilitated China's financial integration into the larger global economy. At the same time, I also argue that in the sort of 2.5 decades before the outbreak of World War I, China went through a phase of financial internationalization, both in terms of the banking sector and in terms of Chinese public finance. And so what I will do in the next 15 minutes or so is I'll try to unpack all of this a bit. I'll start by explaining a bit about the historical background about foreign banking and the book, and the particular case study I focus on, and then I'll move to the contribution and argument of the book, and then finally I'll flesh out the activities of foreign banks a bit more. So to get started, so during the 19th, particularly late 19th and early 20th century, foreign banks came to play a very important role, both for the Chinese state and for the Chinese banking sector and the Chinese economy. So during this period, you have basically European bankers and investors looking abroad because the returns on investment in Europe are going down, particularly sort of after the mid-19th century. They're looking abroad for overseas markets, and China plays a particular kind of role in this because China is kind of seen as this up-and-coming market. The kind of myth of the China market, I think, is a very familiar trope, and many sort of investors and bankers are therefore drawn to China. At the same time, because you have the larger processes of globalization going on, you have a fast growth of global trade, and that in turn needs financing, and that means international banking also expands, and again, China also becomes kind of a target for all of that. And at the same time, what we see kind of happening in China is that foreign trade grows rapidly from the second half of the 19th century onwards, and at the same time, similar to a kind of, at the same time, you have a greater sort of need or demand on the Chinese side for foreign capital, and so these kind of both of these interests sort of come together. So what basically happens is that first in the 1840s you have British banks, and then in the 1840s and after, you first have British banks coming into China, banks like the HSBC that are of course still around, or the Chartered Bank, which now is Standard Chartered. And then from the 1890s, we increasingly also see non-British banks, German banks, Japanese banks, French, Russian banks coming into China and establishing basically bases in the treaty ports along the China coast. And these foreign banks operated in China's treaty ports, and there they issued their own currencies. They would receive deposits, they would issue loans to foreign and Chinese customers, and they would finance China's foreign trade and also help the Chinese government basically go to foreign capital markets like London or Berlin and raise capital there for things like railway construction. And in my book, I try to kind of shed light on these different activities of foreign banks in modern China. Now, what you can see here on the right side of the slide, I guess, is just the two things you can basically see here is first sort of a group photo of several representatives of these foreign bankers. This is from 1911 during particular loan negotiations. And the other picture is basically the Deutsch-Asiatische Bank, which was a major German bank active in China during the late 19th and early 20th century. And this photo comes from their Shanghai branch along the Bund. So one of the most important foreign banks of the late 19th and early 20th century in China was this German Deutsch-Asiatische Bank, or Dehua Inhang in Chinese, which is the case study around which the narrative of my book is basically built. So the bank was established in 1889, and it was established by some of the main German banks with an interest in China at the time, there was a growing interest during the 1880s and sort of to expand German investment and bring German capital to China, and these bankers then felt that a bank was necessary to do that, and the Deutsch-Asiatische Bank, or DAB, was basically the resulting institution when it was established in 1889. Now, with several pauses, the bank actually was active in China or in East Asia, I should say, until 1971. But I think the most important period in terms of its activities was actually between its establishment in 1889 and its liquidation by the Chinese government during World War I in 1917. And during this time, the DAB was both the most important German bank in China and one of the most important international financial institutions operating in East Asia. And therefore, the bank's history, what I think takes us right through sort of the period of modern Chinese history when foreign banks rose to a position of significance both for the Chinese state and local Chinese and the local Chinese banking sector that foreign banks had neither reached before this period nor have ever reached thereafter. And therefore, I think the bank's history is kind of a very good case study for understanding how foreign banks operated in this particular time period and how China was financially connected to the global economy at this time. So next, I want to talk briefly about sort of the contribution of the book and kind of the previous literature that this builds on. But I thought I'd start with this nice picture that I found. That is from a postcard from the early 20th century and shows this nice sort of colorized Bund picture from the Shanghai Bund, and on the left-hand side the DAB again. During the early 20th century. So basically, when I started this topic, what I found was that despite the fact that you see certainly these foreign banks popping up in different kind of books on Chinese history, and they are certainly, it is well known that they were around there, but actually, and that they were important in a certain way, but we still actually know relatively little about their activities, and that's particularly the case when it comes to their interaction with sort of Chinese officials, bankers, and other entrepreneurs. And I think an important reason, I mean, I think there are several reasons for that, but an important reason certainly is that, is what I call the paradigm of imperialism in the book, which means that sort of there has been for a very long time, certainly particularly in the mainland, but I think also in Western scholarship, this idea that, or this view that sees foreign banks mainly as, okay, it's sort of another part of foreign imperialism, and we don't really need to talk much more about it. You know, these foreign banks came in as part of imperialism. They controlled the banking sector. They controlled Chinese state finance, and yeah, that's that. And not much more needed to be said about it. And I think the main problem with this paradigm and approach is that it leaves us with an incomplete picture of foreign banks in modern China that emphasizes exploitation and Chinese victimization, but fails to account for other kinds of interaction between foreign and Chinese actors, like cooperation based on common benefits, competition, changing power relations, and also the larger implications of China's financial internationalization. And most of the existing literature on foreign banks in modern China either follows the imperialism paradigm that sees banks mainly as another part of imperialism in China, or tacitly accepts it. And so that's where kind of my book comes in. Now, very recently, there have been certain studies that focus on a particular small detail of foreign banking in modern China that have started to sort of challenge these kind of old views. But what I kind of do in my book is build on these studies and offer sort of a broad study of the history of foreign banking in modern China that employs primary sources both from East Asia but also from Europe, and examines kind of the activities, gives sort of a broad panorama of the activities of foreign banks in modern China, and takes into serious account their interactions with Chinese actors, goes beyond this imperialism paradigm, and situates foreign banks in China and Chinese finance within the larger process of financial globalization. And more generally, the broader process I describe in the book is, and I've already pointed towards that, is kind of what I call the financial internationalization of China, drawing on William Kirby's important or well-known article on the topic, of course. And I argue that the rapid influx of foreign banking institutions into China from the 1890s to the First World War, accompanied with the unprecedented growth of China's foreign trade and engagement with foreign capital markets during this period, caused the full-fledged internationalization of Chinese finance, so that by the end of this period, we basically see that both the Chinese banking sector on the China coast and Chinese state finance had become part of kind of the global international system and international capital flows, and things that happened on financial markets elsewhere could have quite a big impact on what was happening in China. And I argue that foreign banks and their role as intermediary institutions and their interactions with Chinese actors played a key role in this process of financial internationalization. So during the last few minutes I have, I now want to flesh out the activities of foreign banks a bit more. And that can basically be sort of split into two, I think. So there were sort of two main sides of what foreign banks did in China during this period. And on the one hand side, that's kind of raising capital for the Chinese state, and that basically meant representing the Chinese state in places like London or Berlin. And the other is the Chinese banking sector, and so I'll talk about these two now. So in terms of the first aspect, so the sort of public finance and the big loans that the banks helped the Chinese government with, what I've basically done in this chart and is to give kind of an overview of Chinese external borrowing between 1870 and 1911, and that also serves as a nice sort of overview of explaining the kind of story that I tell in the book about all this foreign borrowing. So basically what I'm trying to see there is, through the lens of the DAB and that case study, I try to understand what changes there were in terms of China's engagement with foreign capital markets. And what you can see here, of course, is that China sort of starts to tap foreign capital and go to, capital markets in London, particularly in the beginning, in the 1870s and 1880s. But it is still rather limited at that point in time, and mostly for military purposes. But what then happens is, of course, the Sino-Japanese War. There's a big indemnity that Japan imposes on China, and China decides to fund that with three big loans that are raised in London, Berlin, and Paris. And the result of that is, firstly, that and this is all, I should say, this is all kind of done through foreign banks who act as intermediaries. And the result of kind of this turning point of the Sino-Japanese War is that, on the one hand side, of course, a big imposition on Chinese state finance. These loans have to be repaid, of course. But at the same time, it also shows many kind of Chinese officials, and you can sort of see that in the discussions that are going on amongst, officials both in Beijing but also in the provinces, how actually easy and cheap it was to raise large sums of money abroad as opposed to China, because in China financial capital markets were not developed anywhere like those were those in Europe, and therefore quite a few officials kind of see this actually as kind of understand this as an opportunity to raise capital rather easily. And I think the result of that is then during the kind of last 10 years of the Qing dynasty, particularly during the Xin, that's the period of the Xinjiang reforms, the new policy reforms, and you have a lot of cost-intensive reform projects, and as a result, of Qing officials increasingly then tap foreign capital markets. And so the larger result of all of that is then that I argue that Chinese public finance during, particularly these sort of 2 decades, 2.5 decades before the outbreak of World War I, becomes very internationalized and connected to foreign capital markets. Now, the second aspect of the activities of foreign banks that I wanted to briefly talk about is the role foreign banks played in the local Chinese banking sector of the China coast. And here I'm mainly interested in how German and other foreign bankers cooperated and competed with Chinese bankers and merchants. Now, when the German and other foreign bankers entered the Chinese banking sector, they encountered the problem that most foreigners that came to China to do business at the time encountered, and that was, in the case of the bankers specifically, they didn't really understand Chinese banking, and they didn't know Chinese, and they really didn't have any possibility of penetrating the Chinese banking sector, which they of course needed to do to actually do business in China and employ their working capital, for example. And this made it impossible for them, kind of to operate this kind of rather ignorance about the Chinese finance. And what they did as a result was, of course, they had to work together with a Chinese business person who could speak English and acted as their Chinese representative, what we commonly know as compradors. And more generally, they had a Chinese staff. Under this Chinese comprador, they had a Chinese department. And that Chinese department would then basically, which was housed in the same bank building usually, would then actually be responsible for engaging with the Chinese banking sector. And just as an example here, you can see the first manager of the Deutsche Sächsische Bank in Hankow, Hermann Wolf, with his Chinese employees. And this comprador and the Chinese staff, they were normally part of, they had normally their own businesses and their own business networks as well. And they would be paid a salary and commission by the foreign bank, and then would manage the interaction with Chinese banks and customers. And indeed, there was close contact between the foreign and Chinese staff, and over time, relationships of trust were built up between the German bankers and their Chinese employees and partners. And it were these Chinese employees and partners that played a key role in the operations of foreign banks and their relationship to Chinese banks, and made the integration, I think, of foreign banks into existing Chinese banking networks and the Chinese banking sector possible. And in the book, kind of one of the main things I try to show is, first of all, that it weren't the foreign banks that controlled really the Chinese banks, but rather that these Chinese bankers had their established networks, and they kind of integrated these foreign banks as sources of cheap capital into existing networks. And secondly, that there was much more interdependence than sort of one-sided control by the foreign banks in what was going on in the banking sector. Because while the Chinese banks were using a lot of the cheap capital that the foreign bankers provided, at the same time, the foreign banks, as I said, were very much dependent on cooperation with Chinese actors to actually be able to operate at all in China. So I think I should come to a close. So in conclusion, I think what my book tries to do is to provide us with a fresh and more balanced perspective on the history of foreign banks in modern China. It shows that foreign banks and their interaction with Chinese officials, diplomats, merchants, and bankers were an important element in China's financial internationalization, and that foreign banks acted as intermediary institutions that provided the financial infrastructure that financially connected and integrated China into the first global economy and made modern economic globalization in China possible. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ghassan. This was record time for presenting such a rich book. It is a really, really good book. Our second speaker is John Wong. He's an associate professor of this institute. He had his PhD from Harvard. He would talk about commercial aviation in Hong Kong and Hong Kong as a global hub. John's always had a global dimension in his work. His first book was about Hao Kwa, a Hong merchant in China during the Canton System times. And whereas most of the books written about this period, very Eurocentric, John manages to look at it from a very new perspective and really contributes to our understanding of the China trade at that time. Now, in this new book, he shows that Hong Kong's position as a global aviation hub was made. That is, it was not born an aviation hub, and I think that is really important. And he highlights all the trials and tribulation of the people who had to put in an effort to meet all the challenges in order to put Hong Kong forward. And so he would tell us this very interesting story. And I think this story is particularly interesting because Hong Kong as an aviation hub is probably very much in the balance today. And of course, our idea, and we really have to rethink what globalization means today. So John, please. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming here today. So I'm delighted to have this chance to share my research with you. I'm in particular delighted to talk about my book in conjunction with the celebration of Ghassan's publication, because this book, and along with his, they're COVID products. There are four of us who formed a study group in the middle of COVID. You see the publication of these two, and then there are two others. One came out with Cambridge last year, or this year, and another one is forthcoming, hopefully to appear next year too. So that was a very productive time. So thank you, COVID, for something. But let me just start with this little clip. I was trying to be nice to you. I would have turned up the volume some as well, because for those of you who have enough life experience to have some recollection of that period, that was quite phenomenal. I went to school at Stone Throw Away from the old Kai Tak for 12 years. That was in the 70s and the 80s. Of course, at that time, I didn't know it, but with all the planes flying over our heads, we had to stop for 30 seconds or so in class, for all the air traffic. We could have actually clocked the growth, economic growth of Hong Kong during that period, simply by tallying the number of interruptions that we had. Of course, I took it for granted, just like we somehow seem to take it for granted that Hong Kong was supposed to be an international hub anyway. Why would it not be? Well, rather than accepting air travel as an inevitable outcome of Hong Kong's arrival in the age of global mobility, this book argues that Hong Kong was not born to be an international hub, not even a regional hub. And by underscoring the shifting process that produced the aviation hub in Hong Kong, I'm trying to look at this whole process in the making. So ostensibly, this book is about commercial aviation in Hong Kong, but it's actually more of a story of post-World War II Hong Kong. It's also a study of globalization and global networks in the making. So as a new technology, aviation held transformative potential. But many of the players who were in the previous networks were keenly aware of the disruptions that this technology would entail, and they tried to shape the development of commercial aviation to their advantage so as to avoid any seismic impact of this new technology. In addition to the sense of inertia, because of such entrenched interest, what you'll see also in the book would be a few recurring themes. You have the need to invest, and investment came in the form not just of airplanes, but also infrastructure. And to finance such investments, you need to figure out what type of flows this new technology was supposed to facilitate. And of course, that all unfolded against the backdrop of geopolitical happenings. So what type of old network was it? Well, before we took to the skies, we had this form of technology called maritime transportation. And it's out of this network that we had the emergence of commercial aviation. And you will see some of the cast of characters from the old technology reappearing in the new scene. The book follows largely chronological order for each period. I tried to tease out some of the important themes of that particular era. And we'll start from the top, which actually happened a little bit before World War II in the 1930s. Commercial aviation happened in Hong Kong because it's a British colony, and you have here the map of the old British imperial route. You will notice that the aviation routes at that time followed largely the coastal routes, the maritime routes that ships used to follow. And they were puddle jumping stops. And what's important is that you are on the map, but with technology maturing, you run the risk of getting skipped over as planes flew longer distances. Now on the chart to your far left, you have this thing vertically called the trunk route of the British Imperial Network. Let me point out for your attention with this red underscore that Hong Kong was not on the backbone, the trunk route of the British network. It was a side route. It was a place marker because that was where the British had in this region its foothold, and it was a vector that pointed north. Who did they meet with? Well, you have the burgeoning interest of the Americans coming to this side of the Pacific, along with their joint venture in China. So it's more of a meeting of the trunk routes from Europe and America, along with a collection of traffic from China to this part of the world. Now you have two pictures here. On the left is the Dorado of Imperial Airways that landed in Hong Kong on March 24th, 1936. And then on the right, you have the Pan Am Clipper, which landed in Kowloon. And landed is a liberal use of the word. It's actually more like docking on the side of the Kowloon Bay. Why is it important? Well, I want to show these two pictures to you because we need to understand that technology did not mature right away. As a matter of fact, you had the coexistence of competing forms in those early days, and that's before what we know as runways would emerge on the scene. We know what happened after this. We had Japanese occupation, and we have World War II. But the negotiations of how Hong Kong was to become an air hub actually happened during wartime. And during that period, British interests actually conflicted with those of its wartime ally, the United States. The United States was busy trying to construct airways into the Pacific, and American dominance of the world was not to be predicated on territorial control, but on the infrastructure of airways that it was supposed to command. Whereas for the British, when they came back to Hong Kong, they were very enthusiastic about building Hong Kong into an air hub. In a 1946 report on the colony, Hong Kong was called a most important link in the network of post-war aviation. What then served Hong Kong was, of course, Kai Tak. But once upon a time, in the 1940s, Kai Tak was not deemed to be a suitable site. As a matter of fact, it was called a place that could never be constructed or expanded in such a manner as to conform to modern aviation standards. They talked about the danger, at times positively dangerous, for modern high-speed airplanes. I mean, for anyone who was born to Kai Tak, it's tough to argue against that. So where did they decide to build an airport? Deep Bay. Where's Deep Bay? Right south of the border from Shenzhen. Well, we know trouble was brewing at that time with civil war in China, but political uncertainties in China notwithstanding, Hong Kong was very confident in the growth of aviation during that period. As a matter of fact, in the 12-month period ending March 1949, there was a doubling of air traffic passenger count through Hong Kong. 75% of them to and from China. So this whole idea of collecting traffic from the mainland through Hong Kong to the rest of the world, it did happen. It was in this context that we have the emergence of two Hong Kong airlines, two, not one. You recognize the bottom of the screen, Cathay Pacific, on the older logo here, and then on top, Hong Kong Airways. Cathay Pacific owes its beginnings to two enterprising pilots who flew during wartime, one Australian, one American. But because nationality was an issue, the dynamic duo ended up selling to a contingent led by Swire. The competition there, Hong Kong Airways, a partnership of what Imperial Airlines has become, BOAC, along with Jardine, Swire and Jardine, entrenched interest in logistics business in this part of the world. The government brokered a north-south split in May of 1949. Cathay was in charge of the area south of Hong Kong Airways to the north of Hong Kong. We know it was a bad deal for Hong Kong Airways. Within months of that deal, the market that was supposed to be, the business that's going to underwrite Hong Kong Airways basically vanished on them as communists took over mainland China. How about the airport? I'm sorry, let me just finish this first. So that two airline configuration continued for a whole decade until Cathay basically took over Hong Kong Airways in 1959. And what then we saw from that period was an area that was basically Cathay's Pacific, or more precisely, Namyang, reconfigured into the area we call Southeast Asia. So what happened to this whole idea of building a new airport? Well, Deep Bay was not going to be happening, not just because militarily, politically, it was just not a wise decision, but also because financial calculations would not allow that to happen. You have a huge drop in traffic, and it was not going to be sufficient to underwrite a new airport at the new site. So we went back to Kai Tak, and the runway that is drawn into the harbor materialized in the following decade. It was a huge blow to Hong Kong in the late 40s, early 50s, but Cold War dynamics had rejuvenated commercial airflows through Hong Kong by the mid-1950s, and Cathay was to ride this particular wave. And in this region called Southeast Asia, Cathay was going to have to fashion its own brand. How did they do that? Well, along with all the other airlines of that era, they conscripted the bodies of female flight attendants. It's not just Cathay. All airlines did exactly the same thing. In the 1960s alone, there are 2 rounds of uniform redesign, and this is an advertisement from 1971 that Cathay placed in the United States. The airline was not projecting just a local Hong Kong image. They hired flight attendants not just from Hong Kong, but from the whole catchment area that was Cathay's, and you see a little bit of a flight pattern in the bottom part of this poster. But in addition to that, you see a full array of the cosmopolitanism that Cathay was trying to project. British pilots, British engineers, Swiss chefs, and of course, local sensitivities. But local sensitivities there was not just from the home base of Hong Kong, but the home turf of what they call the Orient. The next challenge came shortly thereafter. The runway was barely a decade old when we had to plan again for an extension, and this time for the jumbo jets, in particular the 747. But within this decade, Hong Kong had been totally transformed. It was no longer the post-war colony that needed help. Instead, it was an over-performing colony in a waning empire. So Hong Kong, the colony, ended up financing much of the runway development, and with that came the financial wherewithal and discipline for big projects, and just as importantly, some autonomy in negotiating landing rights in farther afield areas. And these are the results. 1974, Cathay flew to Sydney. 83, Vancouver. And it's all the more impressive because it all happened when they were negotiating landing rights in London. This is 1980. So we know of the flexible citizenship of Hong Kongers. This is actually what facilitated that at those destinations. Of course, these are not the only developments at that time. You have the opening and reform of China at that period, and they started coming to Hong Kong. And just as important as these flight routes to and from China to Hong Kong, you have the opening of the airspace over China that required some delicate maneuvers. Well, this was a period in which we started to worry about the future of Hong Kong. And what did our airline do in response to that? Cathay had to remake itself into a Hong Kong airline. What did they do? Well, they did it with shareholding, but with the IPO and some more local investors. And they also started recruiting pilots into commanding positions from Hong Kong. This is a pretty interesting case because most of the airlines in Asia had already started recruiting locally. Why not Hong Kong? Well, you have to remember, the pilots have to come from somewhere. This is a city without its own air force. So you have to start to train them from scratch. And it was not until the 1980s that Cathay started a program. And of course, that's in reaction to a budding rival, Dragon Air, that emerged just right around that time. So if I were to just try to summarize it with the air traffic growth of Hong Kong during this period, you can see that during the closing decades of British colonial control, various factors underwrote the development of Hong Kong trade and aviation business. You see here that you have the early growth fueled by trade with the US, and later you have, well, now we call it booster shot from mainland China that started happening in the late 80s. I closed the book in 1998 with the closure of Kai Tak, and of course that straddled the 1997 divide. I think in our minds, we usually think of this handover ceremony, heavily choreographed with Anson Chan right in the middle and then Chinese on one side, British on the other. But there was yet another highly choreographed scene a year after. This is 1998. The Chinese president came to inaugurate the opening of Chek Lap Kok in conjunction with the celebration of the first anniversary of the handover. He had barely left Hong Kong when Air Force One touched down, the first international arrival at Chek Lap Kok, carrying with it Bill Clinton, the first sitting president of the United States to visit Hong Kong. The opening of Chek Lap Kok was a special project because it transcended political divides, certainly transcended not just 1997, but it even started before Sino-British negotiations in the early 80s. It was to underscore confidence in Hong Kong and the choreographed tandem visit of these two world leaders underscore the enduring role that Hong Kong was supposed to perform in the post-handover period. What happened thereafter was continued growth. You see here pretty exciting growth post-1997. Hong Kong was not simply drawn into the vortex of globalization. Without the persistent efforts of resourceful participants, Hong Kong could easily have devolved into an insignificant secondary location as new technologies and geopolitics reconfigured our global map. Of course, you see here on the far right of both charts the effect of COVID. Commercial aviation came to a grinding halt. It hurt all the airlines in the world, but in particular Hong Kong, because all our flights are by definition cross-border. And that was tough for Cathay and Hong Kong to swallow. Flight movements plummeted by 60% in the year 2020, passenger count nearly 90%. The skies will reopen, and certain industry players would come back stronger than before. The restarting of commercial aviation worldwide will usher in another round of rewiring of global circuitries. The conclusion of COVID could witness either the dissolution of Hong Kong's ties, regional and global, or the revitalization of Hong Kong's status as a hub. Playing out in the skies over Hong Kong, the outcome pivots on the city's ability to demonstrate yet again its ability to negotiate, its nimble posture and delicate footwork as Hong Kong connects global powers on the periphery. And I welcome your questions and suggestions as we explore this issue that is an ongoing concern for all of us. Thank you very much. Oh, let me show you one last slide. You have a 40% discount for the English version, but more importantly, the Chinese version is coming out with Hong Kong U Press. Thanks to two members of the audience, Michael Duckworth and Ken Young. So thank you very much for our local support. Thank you.
our discussant is the other John, John Carroll. John is a professor of history at this university, also from Harvard, and the author of many, many books. They include the Hong Kong-China Nexus, A Brief History of Canton Days, and 2 books on Hong Kong, which have become classics. So, John, you have 4.
Well, thank you. First of all, congratulations, Ghassan and John, for 2 wonderful books, and thanks to both of you and to Izumi and to Elizabeth for inviting me to offer a few comments. I'll start with Ghassan for no particular reason. I mean, he went earlier, he started, except perhaps because his book deals with an earlier, wait, I can take this off, can't I? An earlier period than John's, and it's a period that laid some of the groundwork for the period that Ghassan deals with, although some of these issues were also dealt with earlier in colonial Hong Kong, and of course back in the Canton trade period, which John Wong dealt with so nicely in his first book. I'm probably one of the least qualified people in this room, actually probably one of the least qualified people in this planet, to talk about a book on banking. I can barely balance a checkbook or read a bank statement, let alone figure out how to do online banking. And this is true, by the way. But I am interested in the history of foreign communities in China, in particular the relations between foreigners and Chinese in China. And Ghassan shows how these foreign banks helped China integrate financially into the global economy, and how they provided the necessary financial infrastructure for modern economic globalization in China. And they did so in several main ways. One, they financed China's rapidly growing international trade. They cooperated closely with Chinese banks. And they provided this Chinese state with the capital that allowed China to fund industrialization projects, pay for wars, and most of all, to maintain political stability. And Ghassan, of course, uses the case of the DAB, not our DAB, a different DAB here, to show this, although he also reminds us throughout the book that many other foreign banks were in the picture, and of course, as you saw in that image, that many Chinese actors were also important. And here Ghassan, John does too, joins a group of revisionist scholars, such as William Kirby, who we mentioned earlier, Hans van der Veen, his supervisor at Cambridge, Arbin Wong, and of course Kenneth Pomerantz, who have tried to show how China's modern industry and how you look at this from a more global perspective, right? How you look at China's modern history through a more global lens. But he also reminds us that we know very little about how China was integrated financially into the global economy during the late Qing and the early Republican periods. And here he also joins another group of revisionist scholars, including Hao Yanping, Robert Gardella, and Lin Manhong, who have moved beyond studying foreign enterprises through the lens of imperialism, obviously an important lens, a lens that we cannot throw aside, but certainly not the only lens, right? And these are people who have also shown how Chinese merchants and manufacturers were very skilled in cooperating with foreign merchants and in adjusting to China's growing integration with the world economy. But Ghassan takes this even farther into the realm of banking, and as he explains, we know very little about the role of foreign banks, what we do now, of course, thanks to his book, in the Chinese economy, and the impact, or their impact on Chinese public finance and banking. And there are really 4 main themes here. First of all, Ghassan introduces a new framework for thinking about the history of foreign banks in China. He calls this the frontier bank. And this he borrows from work on 19th century North American banks. It's the first time I've seen the state of Iowa ever mentioned in the case of China, because he mentions a bank in the American state of Iowa. It wasn't even a state at that time, if I remember correctly. And this is actually then derived from Richard White's concept of the middle ground. Again, the first time I ever, actually it's not the first time, it's the second time I've seen Richard White mentioned in the framework of Chinese history. But his notion of the frontier bank, and his notion of the frontier also derives from Mary Louise Pratt's notion of contact zones, right? And these are places where people, different empires and cultures all meet, leading, of course, to conflict, but also leading to cooperation, exchanges, and accommodation. And what this meant in China was that foreign power overlapped and interacted with local power and was often limited or constrained by it. Foreign banks were managed mainly by foreigners, but they depended heavily on Chinese staff, partners, and institutions. Ghassan calls this, and I quote, a dynamic and complex space of Sino-foreign interaction. The second theme that Ghassan looks at is the importance of transnational social networks. And the history of his DAB involves both physical and social transactional networks. And by the way, this is something that just occurred to me when I was thinking about this, that Catherine Lads has also done in her study of the international maritime customs. This came out about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. But the third theme is the relationship between nationalism and economic globalization. Ghassan reminds us that politicians, diplomats, and bankers didn't always see eye to eye, whether this was on the Chinese side or on the foreign side. And finally, the problem of risk. He argues that managing risk is more useful, or the way people manage risk, banks manage risk, is more useful for understanding the actions of these foreign banks than are the imperialist policies of the home governments. So I have 3 questions for Ghassan that I hope maybe we can deal with later. The obvious question, I suppose, is how representative was the DAB, especially since, as you say, it was a relatively latecomer, certainly compared with HSBC, which does figure prominently throughout the book. But maybe how, for example, do you see it comparing with other latecomers, perhaps such as Japanese banks? Question number 2, what about comparing this with what was going on another Chinese frontier? And here I'm thinking, for example, of Pat Giersch's recent book, Corporate Conquests, on business and the state in southwest China. Again, another frontier. And third, you say, I think it's in a footnote, Ghassan, that you prefer the term foreign banks over international banks, and you point out that recent Japanese scholars have suggested international banks rather than colonial banks. But maybe later you can say a bit more about why you prefer the term foreign banks over international banks. Now, I feel a bit more qualified to comment on John's book, both because I'm working also on tourism in Hong Kong, which of course involves civil aviation, but also because, like John, I went to secondary school near Kowloon City. You were closer, but my school was higher up on the hill, and I think we got a slightly better view. All right, my school wasn't too far away from Kowloon City, and if knowing every commercial airline marking, and every model of commercial aircraft had been a school subject at Huayin College, I would have done far better in that than I did in any other subject. If there had been a prize, I would have won. No question. Unfortunately, there wasn't. Anyway, using the case of civil aviation, John shows how Hong Kong became a global hub. Though, as he reminded us earlier, this was not always a smooth or an easy process. Hong Kong had to make itself into an international aviation hub, first by mapping itself onto an evolving aviation network, and then by carving out and asserting its own space in that network. Now, as John shows, and as he reminded us, there was nothing inevitable or preordained about any of this. It involved a variety of factors and developments, including the Cold War, and both international and inter-Asian networks. Now, John says that he's less interested in technology or the cultural analyses of global connectedness. Rather, he looks at how Cold War geopolitics shaped Hong Kong, reconfiguring flight routes and then basically remapping Hong Kong, and also at how air mobility infrastructures shaped Hong Kong's development. This, of course, was not all new, as John pointed out earlier. Mapping Hong Kong onto the global airspace fit with Hong Kong's earlier roots as a shipping center. And in fact, what I've discovered in my own research is how shipping and air travel really fit very well with each other during this period. In fact, the same shipping executives who come from the United States to explore new opportunities for shipping usually came by plane rather than by ship. Yet, as John shows, even this new remapping was not preordained. It was related to Britain's need to invest in infrastructure in Hong Kong, to strengthen the colony, and of course to mobilize it in the global competition for power and wealth, especially during the Cold War and the era of decolonization. So John does this by looking at 2 main themes, one of which we started with, of course, the growth of Kai-Tak. And I think it's worth mentioning that with airports being pushed increasingly farther away from cities, we often forget how they used to be so much more than just places of travel and mobility. They were really part of the economic, the political, the social, and the cultural landscape. The second theme, of course, is Kai-Tak's own carrier, which is really the heart of the book. And these became inextricably linked, as John shows. Though this was not inevitable, Pan Am and Imperial Airways, in fact, had used Kai Tak well before Cathay was even born, and Cathay had to make itself into Hong Kong's airline. British officials, in fact, sometimes look down on Cathay as a colonial airline. A colonial airline, by the way, even farther down the pecking order, below Australia's, the colonial, or the Australia's Qantas, which of course was also a colonial airline. Now, John says he's not so interested in cultural analyses of global connections or connectedness, but I think he does this more than he admits. He complicates our conventional image of Hong Kong as a place where east meets west, something I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about. Instead, he shows how Cathay Pacific tried to make itself something else, right? Cosmopolitan, exotic, oriental, and Marco Polo-esque name, Cathay, but a British airline with British pilots, but with pan-regional cabin crew or flight attendants. And he especially shows this with the flight attendants' uniforms. And he also looks at the aspirational side of civil aviation. Right? Air travel fueled both official and public aspirations, especially in Hong Kong's high-growth economy. And we see this, of course, even today, as frequent flying Hong Kongers try to get back into the air, as Cathay Pacific tries to get back in the air, and as Hong Kong itself tries to show the world that it's back, right? This is the term we've been hearing over and over again for the past week or two. So I have 3 questions for John. Unlike many authors, John, you don't shamelessly make references to your earlier work, but there are parallels between the Hong Kong that you write about here, or are there, I should ask, and the Canton trade that you wrote about in your first book. Question number 2. Your chapter on female cabin crew's dress is fascinating. I'm wondering, did Cathay ever consider anything in terms of dress for male pilots and cabin crew, or is it the case that maybe there's not much you can really do with a captain's or a pilot's uniform? I don't really know. Or perhaps in terms of cabin design. Maybe all cabins look more or less the same. I'm not really sure. Finally, and I know historians, including me, hate questions about the future. Sorry, John. But with all the recent emphasis on the Greater Bay Area, even a new Greater Bay airline, and the recent talk about Hong Kong as a new, as of this morning and yesterday, super connector, does your book offer us any clues to what happens next for Hong Kong, especially in terms of civil aviation? Now, I'll just end with a few themes that tie the 2 books together in 2 ways that might seem relatively obvious, but then one that perhaps doesn't seem so obvious. So it didn't, at least to me, until I read the books. One is the idea of local partners, right? This comes out in both books. The line between foreign and local becomes very blurry, I think, in both cases. The second point or theme is transnational networks. These were important for both DAB and for Cathay Pacific. And finally, this idea of the frontier. Now, Ghassan uses this concept throughout his book. John doesn't do so as explicitly, although early on, page 61 to be exact, he writes how in the Cold War, Hong Kong became, as he puts it, a frontier, a contact zone between imperialism and nationalism. And I think here you're borrowing partly from Prasenjit Dwara. But in fact, both Ghassan and John use the notion of contact zone. Ghassan has shown that treaty ports were a kind of frontier, and certainly a kind of contact zone. And I think we can say something similar about Hong Kong, not only during the Cold War, but because of the Cold War. Right? As various geopolitical alignments were becoming, well, I don't know, for lack of a better word, realigned. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of questions for Ghassan and John, so I'll stop here. Once again, congratulations. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to the questions now, or just leave it? And John? Okay. In that case, you want to sit up here? Well, thank you, John, for those very thought-provoking questions. I'm sure Ghassan and John Wong will both lose some sleep tonight. But we're also looking forward to questions from the floor. Yes.
Thank you. This is really about the bank services and Ghassan. I was wondering what it was exactly that the banks were doing in China, and from what you say, it appears that they're mainly just issuing loans. It doesn't appear that they're, because there's a lot of things banks could do, but they appear to be giving out loans. That being the case, then were they mainly loaning to the government or were they mainly loaning to traders? And when you make a loan, of course, you have to have some kind of security. So what kind of things did they have as security? And I don't know what Chinese law was about at that stage, but I'm not sure that foreign bankers could go around seizing whatever it was that they had as security. So then how did they get how did they have it, and how did they get the money back if things went bad? How did they seize securities and so on? And finally, we know what happened looking back from now with revolutions and wars and everything else. Did they lose their money in the end, or did they actually come out ahead? Thanks.
I'm not sure whether, or should I respond to John?
Go home and sleep over it.
Okay.
Sleep on it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in terms of what foreign banks did, well, I mean, the allocation of capital is kind of what a bank does. They didn't just issue loans. I mean, they would take in deposits as well, issue currencies. And in terms of the loan business, yes, the government. And in terms of government loans, there were securities. Although even that was a bit difficult because, what do you actually know about the income of the central Chinese, state, or even going further over province? I mean, so if you look at old bonds that of Chinese loans at that time, they would normally say secured by such and such revenue. Whether that revenue is really even existent or accurate is sort of another question. But at least in theory, there was kind of a security there. In terms of sort of giving loans in the so what they did in the banking sector. So one part of it is, of course, financing trade, and there were securities there also because their main kind of interlocutors there would actually be foreign merchants, and so often the actual goods that were either sold in China or bought in China would become the collateral. But a lot of the loan business was actually done without collateral, and that was a very risky business. They would basically lend the money into the Chinese banking sector, which was kind of a black box for them, certainly. And a lot of that, although they wouldn't necessarily kind of admit that, but a lot of this was just simply a trust relationship to their comprador, to the kind of network they were in. And I mean, I kind of try to show that the Chinese side were very adept at kind of exploiting the ignorance of the foreign bankers of how how that securities, how that collateral work, and how that the setting of interest rates work in the kind of Chinese banking sector that was kind of beyond their knowledge and beyond their reach. And I think a final point on that is yes, in terms of laws, so once you leave the kind of extraterritoriality, the treaty ports, it was very difficult for a foreign bank to get hold of any. For example, their compradors, in theory, always had to give a security when they kind of signed the comprador contract. But in the cases where these people actually went bankrupt, it was very difficult and often took years or never materialized to actually get any money back. So it was really based on trust. The reason why they did that was because there was really no alternative, and it was high risk, high gain kind of. The interest rates that you could get by loaning your money into the Chinese banking sector were quite significant. The final point, just briefly, whether they lost their money, that's really something you have to look at the individual banks. In the case of the German bank, it really didn't go that well because they were liquidated first in World War I and then again at the end of World War II. So there was kind of a lot of money lost there. And in general, I think, as with most foreign businesses that went to China, I think, certainly during the period I look at, there was always much more of a, the China market, and you can make so much money. But in the end, I mean, I do compare it. If you in 1890 you invested your money in a German bank in Germany, by 1914 you would have made as much money as if you would have invested it in the DAB. So it's not really that much out of the ordinary. Yeah.
First of all, congratulations, Ghassan and John, for the 2 wonderful books. I learned a lot from your sharing. I haven't read the books yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So I have questions for each of you. For Ghassan, I'm very interested because when John made his comments, he mentioned that you use the term frontier banks. So I'm very curious because I use frontier in my new book title as well. So can you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean frontier banks and also foreign bank and international bank, as John asked just now? And for John Wang, your book cover, I really like it. It reminds me of the book cover of Chongqing Mansion. So it's very much similar. The skyscrapers, and you can see a little bit of a sky, and that's implication of Hong Kong. So I'm sure your book may have already talked about, but I'm very curious, who are the key players in Hong Kong takes flight? Maybe British government, local government, or investors. So you may have already talked about it in your book. So can you share a little bit here? Who are the key players in this taking flight enterprise? Thank you.
Okay, it's working now. Sorry. Yeah, Lizzie, thank you so much for the great questions, and I actually get to reply to John in at least part of John's question then as well. So why the frontier? I mean, I think there were sort of two things that I wanted to I thought why it was useful, because I think in the case of China, actually the frontier, at least in the period I look at, we're thinking of normally is not the treaty port, not the coast, but it's rather sort of the west of China, and as you said, Pat Gersh, for example, looking at the southwest. I mean, one thing that was particularly useful was like an edited volume Christian Herriot and Robert Bickers did quite a while ago, where they talk about the China coast as a sort of zone of frontiers. And I think what I liked about that is that, especially when it comes to foreign banks in the previous literature, the sort of supposed nationality of players and the home governments and all these sort of kind of categorizations play a big role in kind of predetermining what kind of analysis people kind of carry out and what they kind of look at and how they look at things. And I think thinking about it as a frontier where you have like these kind of, and there, again, Mary Louise Pratt's context zone is also, I think, very useful, where you have, you go down on the micro level, on the individual level, and you look at how actually individuals interact with each other. You kind of, that's the focus, and it's not so much, is this like a German person now, is it a Chinese person, but rather kind of what is the interaction, what is the actual business that is going on. I felt that was kind of why I was attracted to this particular framing. In terms of frontier bank, why I use that term is also because I think this is, in the end, again, it's not really a German bank, it's a hybrid institution. Because we didn't have time today, I couldn't show this, but if you actually look at kind of, we have architectural plans of these bank branches, you can see that like half of it was the Chinese department and half of it was the European department, as they called it. And it was really, it's not, just a kind of German bank. It was, there was a lot of Chinese staff working in there. There was a lot of Chinese business. In fact, in many fields like the deposit business, the Chinese department was doing most of the business actually. And so this kind of hybrid character, it's a foreign bank that operates in China. It's kind of supposedly German, but actually hybrid. These ambiguities I felt through Frontier Bank came out. That's why I like the term. In terms of foreign banks versus international banks, what terminology? I think both of these terms are fine for me. Like the reason why this group of Japanese scholars that I talk about, why I think use international banking, is because that's kind of their interest. They're not China historians. They're interested in like kind of the international system of payments and so on. So that's why they use international banks. I used foreign banks because I thought it was partly because I thought it was a relatively neutral term if I compare to colonial bank, for example, but also because I think that's the kind of term that is most often used, I guess, in the China history literature. So in that sense, I thought, okay, I'll just stick for simplicity to kind of foreign banks.
Actually, I think hybrid bank sounds good.
Yeah, that could have been.
Well, Gee, thanks for your question, and also gives me a chance to respond to some of John's comments as well. The actors. So when I was doing research, archival work on this project, and there are many moments of deja vu. To look at the business records of British Airways, it's very reminiscent of my looking at the British East India Company's records. They keep records more or less the same way. After all, it's a quasi-government organization, and I'm sure bookkeeping is a lot of continuation of such practices. And on the other side, you have Pan American. Of course, that's a little bit different from my records for the first book. From America, the Pan Am was a lot more sophisticated. than the early American traders. And of course, they converge in this particular place, this part of the region, now reincarnated as the Greater Bay Area. So now in terms of the actors, it's actually quite interesting to think about the disruptions and the continuities there. You mentioned government. Of course, that's a big part of the government records I need to look at as well to see how they negotiated rights, how they allowed whom to operate where. And there's a huge rupture between the authorities here in Hong Kong vis-a-vis their counterparts in London. We tend to think of that as one whole, one group of people. But by the 60s, they were really operating against one another. They were taking, they were taking hard stands vis-a-vis the other part when they were negotiating things like, who's going to finance the new runway in the late 60s and early 70s. But then there were also moments of continuities. If we think of we think of corporates and government as two distinct entities, not quite. One of the chief executives, chair of Cathay Pacific, retired from the company just to become a financial secretary in this colony. So if you think of that as one group of people who were very fluid in moving about, that was precisely that story. Now there were also silent actors in here as well. I mean, you don't hear much of the voices in the archives of the flight attendants or the male members of the workforce, either in the cockpit or in cabin service. But the uniform is actually quite telling. I'm glad that John asked the question about the male outfits. So airlines, whether it's the cockpit crew or the cabin crew, the uniform started more as an inspiration that they drew from military uniform, which is why, if you look at pilots now, they look somewhat like they are in some uniform services. And for the longest of time, it didn't matter for Cathay that the male flight attendants were wearing exactly the same thing as the captain in the cockpit. You can't tell them apart. Why? The cabin crew was Chinese. The cockpit, Caucasians. And it became more of an issue later on, and hence actually now we have male attendant uniforms as well. So if we were to think about that, there are a lot of stories in there as well, but then not necessarily through the voices of those flight attendants. Now to get to the last question about the Greater Bay Area, I thought a lot about that, especially not quite independently in this project, but as I'm trying to think about my own portfolio of work. What we see here is that Canton in the 19th century and Hong Kong in the 20th century into the 21st, they have special status. And hence, you have people from Europe or companies in Europe and America coming here, meeting at this particular place for specific reasons. And we think of the Greater Bay Area as one continuous whole, at least the government would like us to think that way. But then you have geopolitical incidents that will shift the weights from one urban center to another. And that's something that I think about quite a bit. Hong Kong's rise was at the expense of Canton in the 19th century. We do have this new city straight to our north that is growing bigger than Hong Kong at the moment. So how do we think of this whole region and the shifting weights that geopolitical boundaries would create, and how enterprising individuals and companies would then leverage as they meet in Hong Kong and make this area the interface for China with the rest of the world?
So my question is for both John and Ghassan. So your books are finished, so you cannot go back to the archive and do more work to add another chapter. And in your presenting of your work, it's complete, it's built, the argument is fully structured, we can all understand what you're trying to say and how it fits into an historiography. I think especially in Ghassan's case, there's an implication of there being a gap on any deeper understanding in the banks that perhaps drove you to look there for your doctoral work. But while it makes sense now, was there a time in your research when it didn't? Tell me not about the world that you've learned, but tell me about your journey of learning. What were the surprises along the way that you weren't expecting that made you turn your head and reorient your thinking?
Okay, I'll get started. I suppose, the biggest change, I don't think that, I think I started this topic because I thought, I have no background in banking or anything like that, but I started the topic because I thought, well, this is interesting. Not many people have written about it, and I think the whole story of this whole imperialism and stuff, I was kind of, I think I was skeptical from the start. This is one of the reasons I started it, because I felt particularly the sort of Chinese scholarship is just, that is a bit much. Like, it can't just all be, this sort of one-sided. But the big difference for me, I mean, so I spent quite a lot of time in sort of British, German archives, because that's much easier to access and so on. But then I was lucky enough to spend almost 1.5 years in China, where it was much more difficult to do and to get access to archives. So once you actually did, I think, certainly I was kind of, that there was much more interdependence and so on. That was something I found. But I think I call it information asymmetries, or I use that term that is, economists use, information asymmetries, that how little the foreign side knew actually often, and how much the Chinese side knew, and also knew about what the foreigners actually didn't know. That, I think, came out really out of the Chinese sources, and that was certainly surprising to the extent that it was the case, both in the banking sector, but also, there was a question about securities. At some point, the Chinese simply figured out, just give the foreigners something, just call it whatever there's literally like provincial governors that are being told, just come up with something, just give us, say the legion of, salt legion of a particular province is hypothecated. Whether it really exists or not doesn't really matter, just write it on the bond and that's it. And so these kind of things, this kind of information gap or information symmetry that existed, that was certainly, I felt, surprising. So that was the Chinese sources for me. That was kind of it.
Thanks for your question, James. The most difficult thing that I kept revisiting was actually at the request of the press. We want a longer conclusion. You cannot conclude the story here, because it's an ongoing situation. So what are you going to say about COVID? What is going to happen? And I said it's a COVID product. I finished it in the middle of COVID, but then COVID really transformed all these maps. And that was the most difficult aspect of it. The book was published, but I think I am still toying with many of these ideas as I travel. I flew back in August on a flight from JFK to Hong Kong. That was the longest flight that connected Hong Kong with the rest of the world in the late 90s. And that flight just got longer. It was 17 hours. Why? Because you cannot fly the polar route anymore. You cannot fly through Russian airspace. And to my surprise, they didn't even cut across the mainland Chinese airspace. So we went through the middle of America. We didn't go mid-Pacific, but then we were just cutting across from Oregon to over to Japan and then down. Now that got me concerned. Singapore was more peripheral than Hong Kong because you could not fly a long flight the way I just described. But technology has moved on. So just as I said at the get-go, when technology matures, you run the chance of getting skipped over. I don't want that to happen in Hong Kong. Now, the other aspect is really that it's not just politics. I think COVID policies, of course, that's politically driven, has divided our world in funny ways. We complain a lot because we had quarantines that are just getting relaxed, and we think so much of that is Beijing inspired. But I love to have a conversation with my colleagues in Taiwan. I didn't know that you guys are such friends with Beijing, but your policies are strangely familiar with what we have in mainland China and also in Hong Kong. And really caused me a lot of trouble trying to fly back from the US when you have all these circuit breaker issues. I would usually fly through Tokyo or Taipei, neither one of which was accessible to me because I'm not a national of Japan, nor am I a resident of Taiwan. So we can think of it as a political divide, but then COVID policies somehow has inspired a different type of mentality in this part of the world. I was just in Copenhagen. No one is wearing a face mask. We're just walking around like COVID is not an issue anymore. Singapore, the same thing. But then coming back to Hong Kong, even though everything has been relaxed, well, because we have an abundant supply of quarantined people, the same process has to be elongated, 5 different ways, just so that I could, go through a 10-step process just to get my nose poked. Actually, not your nose anymore. It's just a throat swab. It's not a welcoming place when you subject people to that. And unless and until we have an honest discussion about how that is really cutting off Hong Kong for many circuitries of flow, I think it's going to be a long road of recovery.
As an anthropologist, I think I'm really speaking out of my depth. But it's your conversations here just very inspiring, even for an anthropologist. I want to really get into the issue of law. I was just thinking, both in the past, I imagine HSBC and other foreign banks, even back in the late Qing and the Republican period, they were using Hong Kong as the headquarters. HSBC definitely, I think, because I imagine, if I read Zhong Boyin's works well, that so many foreign companies, banks and others, were using Hong Kong as their registered base rather than China. And obviously because there's quite a bit of the commercial law tradition intertwined with the colonial laws, which is very British. Whereas in China, on top of all the political and military turmoil, law is impossible, or more or less, to be enforced in different parts of China. So I just thought that in the banks, in the banking decisions during that period, how much Hong Kong played a very, very crucial role. That's one. Then we, similar to Cathay now, I mean, talking about the future. Now, with the 一国两制, one country, two system, eroding, in my mind, eroding quite a bit these days because of the, of the national security law and, other institutional changes that's happening in the past few years. Law is really being heavily challenged. Now, how would banks, and also how would an airline, which is so international, would have to deal with that shifting weight of the legality of business operations, and how would that affect business decisions for the future? Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong, or China, or wherever. I just thought that that's just something that's very much in my mind, but I have no answers for.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for the questions. First of all, Hong Kong, in terms of foreign banking. So the period I look at, I think by then, Shanghai also becomes quite important. But certainly the earlier period, I mean, Hong Kong, the first foreign banks that came to China were basically British banks that had started off in India, and then they expanded to Hong Kong, and then from there the next step was to Shanghai. And that was also because in terms of kind of information networks, Hong Kong was also very important in terms of the telegraph and so on. The reason why they would prefer, I mean, they would certainly want to incorporate themselves in Hong Kong because the actual, legal basis for that would be given. I mean, I think no foreign bank that I know of really ever thought about incorporating themselves in China. They would do that in the treaty ports through their own consulates or through their own consulates. In Hong Kong, they could, of course, do that as well, or as the HSBC did, or you could also do that in Shanghai, but they would not do it with the Chinese government, certainly. They didn't quite trust the rule of law and so on in China, and they didn't necessarily, it was actually, most of these foreign banks used it to their advantage. So what became very, very popular is, for example, for Chinese customers to put their deposits in foreign banks that were under extraterritoriality because they felt that it was safe from the Qing government or whatnot, and even Qing officials would do that, for example. So that was a big advantage. But the foreign banks were very clear that they would not go. Certainly, Hong Kong or the treaty ports where there was foreign law, that's where they were operating, and I haven't seen any example of of kind of that being they're going sort of over that. I think the other issue in terms of law being challenged, I mean, in my period, the kind of the the best parallel to, I think, what is kind of happening today to a certain extent is World War I, when you have geopolitical tensions, of course. I think we're not quite there now, but also, and I think that always challenges certainly international places like Hong Kong or the international settlement in Shanghai as well, and the legal basis that all these foreign businesses use to operate there then are disturbed suddenly. So certainly my case study, because it was not that as before you had kind of you had the law, the foreign law in a place like Hong Kong or Shanghai, and then everyone that wants to do business in these areas can just do business. But then politics comes in, and the rule of law doesn't really matter anymore. Then you start liquidating businesses, and then how can you really still do business? And I think again we're not quite there yet at the moment, but you certainly see this kind of starting out. Nationality plays a bigger role again, and kind of political motivations start playing a role again, certainly. In the case of my case, the sort of pre and post 1914 is quite a watershed, and I think that's because the whole legal environment is kind of disturbed due to these geopolitical tensions. So that's the parallel I kind of see.
Thanks, Alan. And the one country, two system notion obviously is very important for aviation, so much so that in the Sino-British Joint Declaration you have a whole annex on air service negotiation. But I think more importantly it is how differently the flying experience is that will affect the airlines. It seems like distant memory to all of us now, but pre-COVID you do not necessarily want to be flying in China vis-a-vis Hong Kong, because you could be sitting on a plane for hours before it would take off because of the way they manage their airspace. That's not an issue in Hong Kong. Let's hope it would not be an issue in Hong Kong. But then COVID has also introduced a new dimension to the separation because of differences in quarantine rules or whatnot. There's this tendency of mainland travelers to come to Hong Kong. We have become the funnel again for mainland travelers to the rest of the world. Now, back to the whole erosion of one country, two system, or the separation thereof, I have been wondering for the longest time how HSBC and Cathay could remain in British shareholding. It's kind of incredible that you have the de facto central bank of Hong Kong and also the flag carrier of Hong Kong to have such heavy British investment. Of course, both of them have dealt with it pre-97 in different ways. And of course, Beijing authorities, along with the Hong Kong government, has taken many steps to alleviate the issue. Hence, you have the Monetary Authority, you have other bank note issuing banks. In the case of Cathay Pacific, they were very flexible. Started not just having the IPO, but also sale to Red Capital before 1997, so much so that just before the handover, Swire was not quite the majority holder of Cathay anymore, and right now they are, I think, about 45% with another 30% of investments from Air China. It will continue, especially with the rescue package that the Hong Kong government extended to Cathay. I'm not sure how they're going to repay that, but I would imagine there's going to be some negotiation that would convert some of that into equity that is going to change the balance yet again. I think it's important for us to remember that this whole process unfolded, not just in the stock market, not just in the boardroom, but then there's also discussions in China in the 80s and the 90s when they needed Cathay and the Hong Kong aviation industry to help build the industry in China. Now, the sense of relative dependence certainly has shifted in the last few decades, and I think it's important for us not just to insist on the rules of the game, but also to understand our relative bargaining power, which has not been heading in the right direction for Hong Kong for quite some time now.
Can I just add to Helen's question, and that is HSBC was incorporated in Hong Kong. So it's not a matter of picking where to headquarter, right? So it was incorporated here. We had the Companies Ordinance, 1865. So the bank was incorporated under that ordinance. Shanghai didn't have that ordinance. China didn't have commercial laws. All right, so it was one reason why even British companies that wanted to British who wanted to start companies in Shanghai had to be incorporated in Hong Kong. All right, so for the longest time, Hong Kong was the place where the I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we also introduced a lot of laws like bankruptcy laws in Hong Kong, which Chinese hated. Chinese people in Hong Kong hated those laws. Right? The other thing is, of course, HSBC now is headquartered in London, and it's thinking of coming back to Hong Kong. Yeah. Whether there is, some people might disagree, but I think they had a hard time with the Bank of England because they are, being supervised by the Bank of England. And of course, a lot of their money is made in Hong Kong and in China. So where you make your money, I think, will help to determine where you headquarter. And also the alternatives, if not Hong Kong, where? If not London, where? All right, so I think those are important questions. And I think the very good point, because with the German bank, it was liquidated not because there was rule of law or no law, but because there was war. So as an enemy bank, in Hong Kong, all the German properties had to be liquidated because they were enemy properties. And so in Shanghai, the German banks were also liquidated. So rule of law is very important, but there are other contingencies, like the way the Russian properties are being, whatever, sanctioned against or liquidated or taken over. And a lot of foreign funds are frozen in American banks. So, rule of law really works at different levels. And many properties are threatened, not only because there is the rule of law or not the rule of law, but what certain governments choose to do as a matter of policy. Are there other questions? Do you have the one? Okay. More questions from the floor? Well, I think, oh yes, please.
Thank you, Ghassan. A question for you. As one of your students of your class in this institute, I agree with what you remind us not to generalize our research subjects. So banks, not the extension or a part of the imperialism manipulation in modern China. So I like that. But then what? What motivates them to enter into this business of really doing risky business, lending out loans, even not backed by securities? So can you give an explanation on that? So I think this would pretty much reply to what the commentator John asked about the representativeness of the AB. So if we can get why and what motivate them into China, so actually we can perhaps get aligned with different kinds of institutes, foreign ones that gets involved in modern China. So why? Is it love or charity or, right? So.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Thank you for that question. I don't think it's love. I'm afraid no. The thing is, I mean, I remember particularly when I was doing my archival research in mainland China, I was sort of trying to tell them imperialism. That is really kind of too simplistic. They were kind of I remember someone, they were asking it in a very moralistic way, almost as if asking me, so you think these German bankers were good people and they just wanted to do good for China? No, not really. I mean, they were there because they felt they would be able to make a lot of money. I mean, that was kind of the idea. I don't think in the end it actually worked out because, again, I think this kind of myth of the China market it was always out there. But, if you were like Jardine, Matheson and Company in the opium trade, at that early period you could make a lot of money, but later on in the 1880s, 1890s, really much more difficult. But I think for most of the foreign banks, of course, I mean, I think there's a spectrum. So, yeah, maybe I can also, that has to do with John's question about the how representative is this bank. I think, I take it as being representative of this kind of new strew of non-British banks that come into China after the 1890s. But of course, in the end, you would need to study each bank on its own merits, and there was certainly a spectrum. So in the case of the German bank, certainly in a lot of the literature is kind of seen as a state bank, and I try to kind of push back against that and see that, it's really, in the end, it is all about, being commercially viable and making profits. And there's actually a lot of conflict coming up between the German diplomats and the German bankers, because the German diplomats just want them to support German business, but then the German bankers say, well, unless we can make a profit, we're not interested. But of course, there were also other banks. So, the Yokohama Specie Bank, for example, a Japanese kind of foreign bank that was kind of established in all of East Asia, but also in China, was certainly there was more state involvement. But even there, from the scholarship that I know, was that you still had to keep these kind of banks economically viable, and so that for that reason, I kind of try to bring that more to the forefront, which again is also kind of a reason why I like to look at things from kind of a more micro perspective, because I think if you look at these kind of individual transactions, you kind of see what do they actually want, and then I think things become clearer. And there was a lot of risky business they did, but that could pay off. Certainly for the individual banker that does a particular deal in Shanghai or Hong Kong or one particular branch, that could certainly happen. So I think in the end it's kind of the commercial motive that I try to emphasize more in the book. Yeah.
I also have a question for Professor Ghassan. I know that it might be the focus of your study, but I'm just curious about the relation between the Chinese Maritime Customs Service and the foreign banks, because it actually governed the foreign trade of China at that time, and it was led by a group of foreigners, and many of the governmental debts was actually underwritten by the customs service. So I think it might also play a very important role in terms of the financial integration of China into the global market. Thank you.
Sure. So the Maritime Customs Service, of course, it was it was obviously very important for foreign trade, and also because a lot of these foreign trade revenues were used to secure these larger loans. So there was quite a lot of interaction between the Maritime Customs Service and these foreign bankers. Here again, I have to first defer to my doctoral supervisor, Hans van der Ven, who has written the book on the Customs Service, and he also tries to kind of portray it more as a, there were foreigners, at the helm, but it was a Chinese institution in the end. There's a lot of interaction between the foreign bankers and the Customs Service, but there's as much conflict that you can see there as there is, because the idea is always, okay, they are British, the bankers are British, so they have to collude and kind of make sure to trick the Chinese out of a lot of money. And often the exact opposite is the case. So people like Robert Hart really push the foreign bankers to give out better terms and so on. One interesting thing, I think, where the Customs Service works together with the foreign bankers in an interesting way is kind of knowledge production about Chinese public finance, because that's what the foreign bankers really liked about the Customs Service. They produced a lot of reports on Chinese revenues, and those could be used then for securities, for loans. But for other, legion or other kind of streams of income, that didn't really exist. And so then kind of trying to figure out, one of the chapters I kind of sort of try to, see how the foreign bankers go to the customs, and I like, so, what is actually the sold revenue? Like what is that actually like? What does it actually mean? Like what is the, what revenues are we talking about? And then the customs, they can sort of, from their own experience, go to Chinese officials and then try to figure out, what the kind of supposed budget or revenue streams of the Chinese government are like. So there's quite a bit of sort of cooperation in terms of knowledge production. But generally, I think I try to complicate things again and go away from these sort of simplistic foreign versus Chinese kind of narratives in the book. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. I have a question for Dr. Wong about the ways in which commercial aviation shaped kind of the region. Because I mean, you talk about Hong Kong becoming a global aviation hub, but I'm thinking about the ways in which aviation is a little bit different than earlier forms of transportation, like shipping, for example, when you're very much connected with ecological factors, right, with the oceans and oceanic currents and so on. Of course, steamships changed that, but with aviation, right, and you can fly technically anywhere. And I'm thinking about the ways in which the Cold War especially realigns territories. And so I'm thinking, my question is, where were the flights going? Where was the kind of the weight of the flights? Were they going to Britain? Were they going transatlantic, or were they going within other parts of Asia, the British Empire? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the question. I think there are two things that I would like to cover. One is the routes. The other one is whose airline are you flying and what the experience was. So the routes, certainly to Europe and also to America, and not to all places in Europe. Some countries, some airlines had a more difficult time getting to Hong Kong, especially KLM. That took them a while before they secured the rights into Hong Kong. And on the other end, you have the routes that took us from Hong Kong, perhaps through Tokyo, and then loop up to North America before we could have direct flights. That was more in the 80s and the 90s. Now the experience can be quite different depending on which airline you flew. So I showed you how recent the direct flights on by Cathay Pacific to Australia, to Europe, and also to North America. That was the opportunity for you to really brand yourself, because it's the whole experience that you would have flying on a particular airline. And in particular, it's just really the interaction with the cabin crew. Now, of course, we add on to it now your in-flight entertainment and also your meals and everything. But that was your first experience. If you were to fly in to Hong Kong from a different area, you basically encounter Hong Kong before you reach Hong Kong. The same is true. You have more of a sense of pride, local pride, if you fly your own airline to a certain place, which is why I find it quite interesting that we developed our pride in Cathay Pacific relatively late in the colonial era. And it seems to be evaporating just as quickly because of political reasons. And that's sad for me. I hope we can arrest that particular decline. But this was the pride of Hong Kong. I hope it remains the pride of Hong Kong. I guess with some competition from our Greater Bay Area airline, maybe we will resurrect our trust in our own operator.
Well, I think this is it. Thank you, Ghassan, and thank you, John, and thank you, John. Two wonderful books and very thought-provoking. And I think John has raised some really good questions about your books, and we've got some really good questions from the floor too. But I think that's what good books are about, and that is they raise questions. So buy the books, read them, and write to them for answers about the questions. And thank you all for coming, and hope to see you again very soon.